It's the Bradley J. Show. It's Friday, and we are here with Rich Rubino, our political historian and commenter. I want to let you know that I have new travel videos on Bradley J. Travel on YouTube. Go there and subscribe, seriously. And Rich has a book. It's a trivia book. He's got 5 books. Show us the book, Rich. I love
This
this
is the
book.
latest.
It's called The Big Giant Book of Political Trivia. What is it called
The
again?
Great American Political Trivia Challenge.
Okay.
Political trivia on steroids.
Beautiful. Today we're going to talk about dark horse candidates. A dark horse candidate is a horse that starts at the back of the pack, so far back you can't hardly see them, and sometimes they come up and they move up and they move up, and sometimes they win. We'll talk about past dark horses who may have done well or even won, and this race as well. Potential dark horses, and Nikki Haley, as we discussed earlier, doesn't really count as a dark horse because she's fully exposed. She's in the race. She's out as a candidate. And, of course, DeSantis, not a dark horse, very much up front of the pack. We're looking for people who perhaps we might have not even heard about or of. Anybody in this race, Rich, who might fill that bill?
Yeah, there are a few. So most polls right now show Trump is a preponderant front runner, Ron DeSantis a distant second place, and then everyone else is basically 3% or below. So the question is, almost always there's a dark horse candidate. If you look in history, it goes back to James K. Polk in 1844. He was a former Speaker of the House, but he was also a former governor of Tennessee who lost his bid for re-election, then tried to run again, lost his bid the second time. In 1844, he was at the convention as a prospective vice presidential candidate. He wasn't at the convention, rather, but his supporters were. And Martin Van Buren, he was supporting Martin Van Buren vociferously for a non-consecutive term. Van Buren had lost in 1840. Then Van Buren could not get enough delegates. Eventually, he had to drop out. And that former President Andrew Jackson was a kingmaker, and he said this guy James K. Polk, a fellow Tennessean, he should be our nominee of our party. So on the 9th ballot, eventually James K. Polk became the nominee. And that was really the first one. You have other ones, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876. Most recently, Jimmy Carter in 1976, a poll in 1974 of 35 potential Democratic presidential nominees. Jimmy Carter was not even on the list. He worked like the Dickens to get into in Iowa, New Hampshire the next year or so. All through 1975, he didn't have a day job because he was now a former governor of Georgia. And eventually, he garnered the Democratic presidential nomination. Those were dark horse candidates. So this time around, well, the reason I think it's interesting is David Burgum is, the governor, Doug Burgum, rather. I'm sorry, the governor of North Dakota is somebody that very few people outside of North Dakota have heard of. He's somebody that is announced. He has legislative session just came to a halt, and he says that he's seriously considering a presidential bid in 2024. Now, obviously, very obscure. And the first thing you say, well, he's a small state governor. Small state governors don't get anywhere. Well, one example would be Bill Clinton in 1992. In 1991, and around February, he was at 1% in the polls. 1992, he was the Democratic nominee. Another example would be Howard Dean in Vermont. In 2003, as he announced his candidacy, he was seen as kind of an obscure backwater candidate. But because he had a message of being against the war in Iraq, eventually young people gravitational pulled toward him. And he landed up becoming a front runner until Iowa, where he lost. But he was an early front runner, even though he was from a small state. So why could he potentially be a formidable candidate? Not that he necessarily could win, but why potentially could he actually could he effectuate some coverage in the next few months? For one thing, he has a lot of money. He had a software company that he sold to Microsoft. It was $1 billion software company, so he has a lot of money. He has almost unlimited expenditures. He can say he has executive experience, and in terms of having conservative bona fides, he signed one of the most restrictive abortion laws in American history in North Dakota, and the largest tax cut in North Dakota history. So that's stuff that he can essentially point to as his conservative bona fides, but he also has somewhat of a moderate temperament. That would be one. Another one would probably be, although you're going to hear a lot more about him, would be Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina. Interestingly, Nikki Haley actually appointed him to his Senate seat after Jim DeMint resigned his Senate seat midterm. So she appointed Tim Scott, and Tim Scott is one of the few people who I think probably can consolidate support and be some sort of a reconciler between the insurrectionists, the Donald Trump bloodline of the party, and the establishment bloodline of the party, because the people in the establishment, the Republican Party, absolutely love him. The people who are actually in the party, who are actually his colleagues in the Senate. But on the other side, he also has some overtures that he can make to social conservatives, for example, as well as kind of Trump conservatives. So he might be somebody that can kind of consolidate support and be what James K. Polk was, which is kind of a compromise candidate, not necessarily everybody's favorite candidate, but if there's somewhat of a deadlock, he could be somebody that potentially could be that dark horse candidate.
The North Dakota, Doug in North Dakota, does he have any baggage?
Doug Burgum. Well, yeah. The first thing is he's governor of North Dakota, and as soon as the first thing you say when you say North Dakota, people say what? They say North Dakota. That's smaller than a lot of major cities in this country. It's such as obviously geographically it's big, but in terms of population, so that's one of the big issues. The other issue is certainly going to be name recognition. But the reason I mention it, and also the reason I mentioned Tim Scott has a lot of money from his Senate account that he can transfer over to his presidential account. He had very nominal opposition last time, so he didn't have to spend a lot of money.
So he's got his own money, and he can use that money.
Yes, he did not have a major candidate last time running for re-election, so he can use that money because it's a federal race, and he can use those expenditures in his presidential race. He also is somebody who has a lot of support in the donor community of the Republican Party because they see him as somebody who potentially could be a winner in the general election. And money, obviously, is the mother's milk of politics, as Mark Hanna, who ran William McKinley's 1896 presidential campaign, said there are two things that matter. There are two things that are really important in politics. He said money, and I can't remember the other thing.
Why do these donors like him as opposed to others? What do they like about him?
Well, there are a lot of other candidates they like too, but part of it is because his story, somebody who grew up in poverty, African American, eventually became a congressman, grew up to be congressman from the North Charleston area, became a United States senator, somebody who's been able to kind of work with both sides of the aisle somewhat, at least on issues like police reform, for example. He's worked with Cory Booker, but also somebody who's able to galvanize the Republican base. He delivered the Republican response, for example, to the State of the Union address, to Biden's State of the Union address in 2022. And he talked about essentially, it was very similar to this year with Sarah Huckabee Sanders going after kind of the woke agenda, that type of a thing, going after a kind of, so he basically can kind of hit, he can be somewhat of a full spectrum conservative, if you will. He can hit the social conservatives, he can hit the fiscal conservatives, and he certainly can go. He's certainly some of the insurrectionists. I think he'd be less objectionable. The issue is he's not going to be a lot of people's first candidate. But if Trump implodes, if DeSantis implodes, he would potentially be there. And worst comes to worst, there's always the potential that if he does implode early, or if he runs a very redoubtable campaign and does not necessarily ruffle any feathers, that he could potentially be a vice presidential candidate for somebody else as well.
So there's no chance that Trump explodes, blows up, because if that were going to happen, that would have already happened, right? Nothing, not an indictment in Mar-a-Lago docks or Atlanta or related to January 6th. Nothing.
I think that's
none of those things would dig into his 28 to 30%.
No, and that's how he won last time. Last time, 60% of Republican primary voters voted for somebody else in the primary than Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't even win 40%. He didn't win 50%, a majority of the vote till any state until it came to his home state of New York. He was doing this by winning 39, 40, 41% of the vote. That's really all he needs. He doesn't need an outright majority. He doesn't need to overwhelm the scene. And as long as there's 7,647 other people running and they're all splitting the anti-Trump vote, he gets that 40%. He's going to be the Republican Party's nominee.
Okay, back to dark horses. Anybody else?
In terms of this race, I think that there are some potential dark horse candidates. One would potentially be Asa Hutchinson, as kind of who's very conservative himself, but he's also somebody that potentially could also have the support of kind of the Never Trump crowd, which doesn't mean he's actually going to win, but it means he could actually be a formidable force and somebody that Donald Trump will actually have to go after. And usually when Donald Trump takes somebody seriously and goes after him, that shows that they're obviously are somewhat at least of a threat to him. So I mean, so that's certainly one. And that's also in terms of the anti-Trump crowd. I would watch Will Hurd. He's somebody that's not going to get the nomination, but he's a former congressman from Texas, former military officer, African American. He might actually create some waves amongst the anti-Trump folks because there is an aperture there with Larry Hogan, the former governor of Maryland, announcing he's not going to run. There's basically an aperture for a moderate Republican who's anti-Trump. You would say Liz Cheney, but Liz Cheney is actually one of the most conservative members of the United States Congress when she was in there. I don't think she's necessarily, once people figure out her voting record, as well as who her father was, I don't think she's going to garner a lot of support from the left if she does even get into the race. I don't know if she necessarily will.
Do you think she will? That was going to be my question.
I don't think she will. No, I don't think she's going to get in, but I think that there will be I think that the anti-Trump Republicans will probably consolidate around one person, and Bill Hurd is obviously somebody who potentially could garner support amongst that constituency. And also Chris Christie, the former governor of New Jersey, is somebody who actually, interestingly, back in 2000, when he first was elected and governor of New Jersey, and they're elected on off years in New Jersey. So 2009, he beat the incumbent John Corzine. And then his first 2 years in office, when he would go to town hall meetings, and he would sometimes really go after people who would come after him. Folks like Rush Limbaugh were saying, this guy should run for president in 2012. This guy was an early front runner. He said, no, I'm not going to run in 2012. He ran for his own re-election in 2013, won with about 60% of the vote. But then Bridgegate and everything else, his second term, became somewhat of a disaster politically. And in 2016, he was really an afterthought. But there's always the potential, because he does have charisma, because he's the one person in debate who could probably take on Donald Trump.
Right.
And he's a very good debater. He could potentially garner support as well.
Why does Bridgegate, why was that a problem for him where it would not be for Donald Trump? Say if Donald Trump had done the same thing, it would be just it would be no big deal. Why is that?
It's like when Bill Clinton and Al Gore would go through a car wash, and Bill Clinton would stay dry and Al Gore would get wet. Because in 2000,
that's just the way it is.
Yeah, Bill Clinton would have 66% job approval rating, and then despite what happened with Monica Lewinsky and all, but then Al Gore was the one who landed up being hurt by it, because people started to associate him. So eventually he landed up choosing Joe Lieberman as his running mate, who was somebody who would take the first Democratic senator who had really taken on Clinton over his indiscretions. It's very similar. I mean, Donald Trump, at least with his base, can really do no wrong. Now, there are a lot of Republicans who vote for him and independent leaning conservatives who will vote for Donald Trump, but he's not necessarily their favorite candidate. And they were saying they like his policies, but they might be saying we really need somebody else. And that's where somebody else who would support similar policies to Donald Trump, or for that matter, someone who's just a traditional conservative, basically any other Republican nominee from Eisenhower through Mitt Romney, and they don't necessarily like his views on trade, immigration, or foreign policy, but they'll go with him because he's a Republican, and at the end of the day, he will give them capital gains tax cuts.
Maggie Taylor Greene, or just Maggie Greene? Can I say Maggie?
She's divorced now, so you can call her, or she's getting a divorce. So I guess
Maggie Taylor.
You can theoretically you could say that, yes.
Okay, I will. So future Maggie Taylor, did she actually file impeachment?
Yes, she did. Marjorie Taylor Greene. She did this also, though, the first day she got in Congress, too.
So my point is, doesn't everybody understand that when you do that, it only helps your opponent, from whether it be Clinton and Lewinsky or Trump and his problems? When you do that, when you attack the person like that, their base kind of rallies around.
Oh, absolutely.
And so this is probably a mistake by her, right?
Yeah, but she's not. I mean, I'm sure she probably knows that, and she knows it's obviously it's not going to get out of the hopper. But she knows that this is more a matter of propitiating her own base,
right? Just play into the base.
She knows that it's gonna get some social media hits. Some people are going to say impeach Biden. There'll be bumper stickers that'll say impeach Biden. But for all practical purposes, there's not going to be an actual movement to impeach Joe Biden. And in the case of Bill Clinton, you're right. Bill Clinton had a job approval of about 63%. When the impeachment began. By the end of the day, 1998 midterm elections, for the first time since James Monroe in 1820, a party actually picked up seats In the House of Representatives, in the 6th year of the presidency, his job approval rating went well over 70%. So it usually backfires. But in this case, Joe Biden doesn't really have a base. A base candidate is someone like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, someone to the left. Joe Biden is more somebody that they settled for, the left wing of the Democratic Party, because they thought that he was electable. But Bill Clinton was very similar, and many people on the left who were very skeptical of Bill Clinton because they thought that he was that he was very much too moderate for them. A lot of those people ended up consolidating on Bill Clinton because because essentially they really hated the adversaries despite any objections they have toward Bill Clinton. In the case of Joe Biden, Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to garners a lot of media coverage for this, but for all intents and purposes, it's really going to go nowhere. There'll be a few members of the Freedom Caucus that will support her, but in terms of actually getting the Judiciary Committee to consider articles of impeachment, then getting and then for them to vote it, then getting in the House of Representatives, voting for it, and then the Senate overwhelmingly voting to actually convict him. I mean, this is essentially, the chances are infinitesimal that gets any play outside of the conservative base of the Republican Party.
I'd like to point out a little bit of a discrepancy between rich politicians and us. It seems that when you're talking about the Mar-a-Lago documents that they have to establish, that the president knew the proper procedure, but I always grew up hearing ignorance of the law is no excuse. You had to know the law. If you broke the law and you didn't know the law, too bad. For some reason, if you're rich, you had to know, and they have to prove that you were aware of the law. Even if you were, and you say you didn't, they weren't, they have to prove you were. I see another discrepancy between the rich and the poor there. That's just an aside. Okay, how about historically, and this is your wheelhouse here, dark horses who did well in the past.
Yeah, and as was aforementioned, James K. Polk is a perfect example. He was a Tennessean. He had been Speaker of the House. Then he ran for governor of Tennessee, won, and then he lost re-election, ran again for governor of Tennessee, lost again. And then he was only there essentially as a potential vice presidential candidate. Rather, he wasn't there, but he had supporters at the convention. Martin Van Buren could not get the delegates, and James K. Polk was an early Van Buren supporter. So eventually, Andrew Jackson, the former president, was a kingmaker and said, "We need James K. Polk. This guy can consolidate support from all different factions of the party." He lands up winning the nomination, and he lands up winning the presidency. Franklin Pierce in 1852 was certainly a former congressman, senator from New Hampshire, was certainly not the early frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination. But again, you have this kind of fractured Democratic caucus. Eventually, James Buchanan wins, and then he becomes the nominee and defeats Lewis Cass in the general election. Now, here's a fascinating one: is 1880. Okay, now here's just for some background. Ulysses S. Grant had served for 8 years as president. He was seriously considering running for president in 1876, but he chose not to, in part because the country was in the midst of a depression, the Panic of 1873. He was largely blamed. A newspaper criticized the potential of Caesarism, meaning that Ulysses S. Grant would be like a Caesar if he actually served for a third term, which was unprecedented at the time. So he bowed out. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president and agrees to only serve one term after a disputed election, part of his deal in 1876. So in 1880, after Grant had spent 2 years, 2 years perambulating all over the world, getting receptions everywhere because of his service in the military more than his service as president, he comes back and he tells delegates to the convention, if you put my name in at the Republican convention and I win, I'm going to serve. So he was one of the early front runners, and so you had him, and then you had a young congressman named James Garfield from the Ways and Means Committee, who was the likely senator who was likely the next senator from Ohio, because at the time the legislatures chose who was going to be the senator. This is before the Constitution, the amendment that allows for direct elections. So the Republicans had an overwhelming majority, and they said they'd pick Garfield. Garfield was there simply to nominate James Sherman from his home state for president. He gives a rousing speech for James Sherman. James Sherman doesn't win, but people start yelling, "We want Garfield. We want Garfield. We want Garfield." Garfield says, "What are you talking about? I'm just a congressman. I'm just here to nominate my friend and fellow Ohioan, the favorite son, John Sherman." Well, it's a very disputed election. You have Grant, you had James G. Blaine, from the former the Speaker of the House from Maine. Eventually, by the 36th ballot, James Garfield lands up getting enough delegates and winning the Republican Party nomination. So think of this now. You go to that convention, you think it's probably going to be Grant, maybe Sherman, someone you've always all heard of. At the end of the convention, at the time, you're not watching television, so it takes a few days, potentially a day or so to get the news. You read of this obscure member of the House of Representatives who's the Republican Party nominee. He lands up winning in a razor-close election against the former General Winfield Hancock, and he becomes president of the United States, the only person in American history ever to go directly from the House of Representatives to the presidency. So that is, I think, kind of the quintessential dark horse candidate.
Nice.
And I'll say contemporaneously, the other one I bring up all the time, Jimmy Carter in 1976, that poll in 74, Jimmy Carter was not on the list. He was such an obscure candidate, but he did not have a day job anymore. So he went all over Iowa, went all over New Hampshire. At one point, he shook hands with a store owner at a general store. And he said, "I'm Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president." And the guy says, "Jimmy who?" And then Carter kind of used that to his advantage. Eventually, he landed up coming in second in Iowa to uncommitted. And then he landed up winning New Hampshire, and then he became like hell on wheels. He just steamrolled and became this juggernaut. And eventually, toward the end, Senator Church from Idaho and Governor Jerry Brown of California get into the race and part of a Stop Carter movement. They could not stop him. They did win some primaries at the end. Brown won his home state of California, for example, but Carter won the nomination. And it was interesting because some Democrats, this is one of those scenarios where there were some Democrats from kind of the liberal wing of the party who said, "Who is this guy? Why do we all of a sudden have a Southern moderate born-again Christian as our nominee?" And George McGovern, who was the 1972 Democratic presidential nominee, later said that he himself had supported Gerald Ford for president. Hugh Carey, the governor of New York State, he said he supported Gerald Ford for president because they viewed Jimmy Carter very much as kind of inhospitable to their ideology. And when he was president, he always had a problem, not so much with the right, but with the left. And in 1980, when he ran for re-election, Jerry Brown and Ted Kennedy gave him a very formidable challenge.
What about Sununu 2? I call him Sununu 2.
Chris Sununu, yes. He's somebody that also...
Because his old man would be Sununu 1.
Yes.
Okay.
His old man was the governor of New Hampshire and then became chief of staff to George H.W. Bush and was later a host of Crossfire. He's interesting. He's somebody that probably is too moderate and too anti-Trump to actually win the nomination, but he's also somebody that can be a wild card in the state of New Hampshire. The last poll I saw shows he's about 17% in the state of New Hampshire and about 1% nationally. Now, he has to win New Hampshire in order for him to be a formidable candidate, and he has to win big. In 1992, right. Tom Harkin won Iowa. He got virtually no coverage because he was from Iowa, and all the other candidates stayed out of Iowa. 1992, that year in New Hampshire, the next contest, Paul Tsongas won by 9 points. But Bill Clinton called himself the comeback kid because after the Jennifer Flowers and the draft issue, he had gone down to about 5%, but he came up and he won about 26%. He called himself the comeback kid because he came in second place. The next day, the media coverage was the comeback kid being Bill Clinton, not Paul Tsongas, because Paul Tsongas wasn't even from New Hampshire. He was from the neighboring state of Massachusetts. So people said, well, he's from New England anyways. So Chris Sununu, essentially, if he doesn't win New Hampshire, I don't see how he goes anywhere. And if he does win New Hampshire, next year the coverage is going to be, well, of course, he's the incumbent governor of New Hampshire. How is he going to lose how would he possibly lose New Hampshire? So, right. and it's interesting. I think you see the same scenario in South Carolina with Tim Scott and Nikki Haley, both favorite sons of South Carolina, because if one of them wins South Carolina, the coverage is going to be, well, the voters know them best. They have ecumenical name recognition in the state of South Carolina. Of course they're going to win. But I don't see where Chris Sununu necessarily does well anywhere other than New Hampshire. And there's always a possibility. He hasn't announced yet. He's certainly considering running, but there's certainly the possibility that he doesn't, and he might be better as just kind of the referee of the New Hampshire primary and a kingmaker that every candidate except Donald Trump, who's really kind of on the outs with him, tries everything they possibly can do to get his endorsement at the last minute. And he is very popular. He just won re-election overwhelmingly in the state of New Hampshire. If he makes an endorsement on the eve of the primary, that potentially could be a difference maker.
Okay, back to DeSantis.
Yeah.
Disney's saying, hey, you know what?
Yep.
We're not going to build our $1 billion other facility in Florida because of you, DeSantis. That's going to be pretty damaging.
Oh, absolutely. Can't imagine how it wouldn't be. I mean, I understand what he's trying to do. He's trying to present himself as a tribune of social conservatism. But when you're taking on, I mean, he's just giving talking points to his opponents in the primary. Chris Christie has already essentially gone after him for this. Mike Pence, the serving of social conservatism, he's going after him for this. But essentially, you're right, though. When you have an employer of your state, and this is something, if I'm running against Ron DeSantis, I'm saying, you're the reason that 2,000 potential jobs making about 120 average $120,000 a year are not in the state of Florida right now because you use the overweening hand of the state government to go after your own constituents. And how does Ron DeSantis come back with that? He'll probably say something to the effect of, well, I don't apologize for my conservatism, something like that. But and there might be some social conservatives who say, yeah, take on Disney. Disney's part of the liberal corporations, everything else. But I think that he certainly has given an issue to his opponents.
He could lose his state, couldn't he? He could lose the governor gig if he ran for that again. I mean, that's a major drop the ball.
Yeah, that would he. Well, I don't know if he would actually lose that. He just won with 59% of the vote.
I know, but still,
the biggest victory since Bob Graham in 1982. He is somewhat popular there. His job approval is right around 55-56%. But
still,
though before the Disney thing,
we'll see.
But it's interesting. I think that might contribute. I think you're going to see a downfall the way you saw, for example, Dukakis in Massachusetts. I think that he's basically going to live in Iowa just about the next year or so. And Nikki Fried, who's the chairman of the Democratic Party, has the message essentially, we elected you to be governor of Florida, and you're essentially becoming the governor of Iowa. He says there's a possibility DeSantis might do. To Chuck Grassley, he's the incumbent Republican senator from Iowa. He's 89 years old, and every year he visits all 99 counties of the state of Iowa, some of them very obscure, very rural. Ron DeSantis is considering doing that himself, visiting all 99 counties in the state of Iowa. If you're visiting all 99 counties in the state of Iowa,
you're not doing your job.
You're spending a very little time in the state of Florida. So I can see his job approval rating. Essentially, I can see it winnowing down, and I can see him potentially being an albatross on whoever the Republican candidate is for the Florida governorship in 2026.
I'd say if you can't even keep Disney jobs in your state, then how are you gonna how good are you gonna be for the U.S. economy?
That's an issue. That's something that Chris Christie will go right after him on. And you know why I say this could potentially hurt his successor in running for governor is because very similar scenario would be Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, his first 2 years in office, his job approval in Massachusetts was about 60%. His second 2 years in office, he moves to the right and he decides he's going to run for president. So he becomes chairman of the Republican Governors Association. His last year in office, 2006, he spends 212 days out of state, almost all of it on campaign business. So who's hurt by that? Carrie Healy, his lieutenant governor, running to succeed him. She essentially, and by the way, Mitt Romney makes fun of the state of Massachusetts. He would talk about being a cattle rancher at a vegetarian convention, for example. So Carrie Healy ends up losing her bid to succeed him, and Mitt Romney becomes an albatross, has a job approval of about 37%. So that potentially could happen if Ron DeSantis essentially becomes the de facto governor of Iowa, visiting all 99 counties. But on the other side of that, most people in Florida, when he's running for re-election, knew that he essentially was going, that as soon as he gets reelected, he's probably going to run for president, and they still voted for him. So he can essentially go back to them. He can say, well, the voters know that the voters know about technology, and I can essentially, govern from anywhere. But the governor of Florida will likely be somewhere in Dubuque, Iowa.
There's one thing we haven't covered, and that is the rumblings, the rumors of perhaps allegations that Rudy Giuliani was involved in some sort of scheme to sell pardons, which is what is it when the Pope was selling indulgences so you could get into heaven? It's the same thing. That didn't go well. I mean, that really is, if that turns out to have any beef at all, if it's true, or if people think it's true, Is that something that even, and if the president, I mean, were, as I heard, the allegation to split these with Giuliani, these
Yeah,
$2 million
potentially up to $2 million. Yeah.
indulgences, is that something that would even harm the base? It's like, gee whiz. I mean, how low can you go if that were true? I mean, anybody else would be destroyed by that. Destroyed.
He's
That goes.
Teflon Don.
Yeah,
With
I
his
know,
base.
but there's nothing, not even that, that would, like, is it true? Is what the president said true? Really? If he went out on a New York street and shot somebody, no big deal, still got 30%.
I
What do you
think
think?
from a literal standpoint, no. I think if he did shoot someone on Fifth Avenue, I do think then his base would probably crumble. Um,
Okay,
at
so
first,
let's backtrack that to, if there's anything to the rumors
yeah.
of selling pardons. Is that
Well,
how,
obviously,
does
right
that
now
move the needle at all?
it's going to be conjecture right now. Obviously, Giuliani will deny it, and Trump will say, "I knew nothing about this," and most of his supporters will say, "Oh, this is essentially not true. It's somehow part of the deep state, or it's somehow part of the liberals trying to take on Giuliani." So, no, I don't think that's going to be. Now, if you catch him red-handed, if there's like a Bob Blagojevich caught red-handed trying to sell Obama's Senate seat,
Well, yeah, I
there,
know.
there was actually a tape of him trying to
Right.
do it. If you get to that point, then my guess is part of his base will alienate him, will be alienated from. Others will say, well, Donald Trump's not perfect, but we have to do everything possible so that
Right.
Joe Biden does not retain the presidency. Something to that effect.
Right.
Or they'll say, you know what, I don't necessarily like Donald Trump the person, but my 401k was doing well when he was president, or something. Or for that matter, they'll say, yeah, but he really represents us. So essentially, if he's he may have some ethical indiscretions, but he's somebody that represents blue collar voters, something to that effect. So
Yeah.
I think that there will be people that will basically stay with him, as Bill Clinton used to say, until the last dog dies.
So about these allegations of selling pardons, it seems like we would have heard about it before, and if they were doing it, somebody else would have heard it. This, it's a pretty small and thin line to that, to
Well,
connect
Roger
them.
Clinton
That's
was
just one person. One person finally comes out and says this. That seems thin.
Roger Clinton was accused of this on the last day of the Clinton administration.
Roger.
Some people in Alabama, and Roger Clinton was accused of this. He denied it, but Clinton actually pardoned Roger Clinton for a past cocaine conviction, believe it or not. But it kind of went by the wayside. But at the end of the day, I don't think that this is necessarily, at least in the general election. In the primary, this might get some voters to say that potentially, like Trump, you know what, there's going to be an electability. This is going to be a big incubus in the general election. We need to take this off, and we need to kind of vote for somebody who's a more established Republican, which could benefit someone like DeSantis or Burgum or somebody else. But in the general election, 94% of Democrats voted for Joe Biden last time. 94% of Republicans voted for Donald Trump. It's hard to see a scenario where many of those Republicans vote for Biden and many of those Democrats go over and vote for Donald Trump. Now, there's a group called No Labels, and the group called No Labels is trying to get the signatures in line. And they've already done it in some states like Arizona and Oregon, so that if they don't like the two candidates, they can potentially nominate somebody else as a third-party candidate. And there might be some people potentially on the right, if they like the third-party candidate and they live in a safe state, might say, well, you know what? I'm really so disaffected by Donald Trump and his ethical indiscretions. I don't like Joe Biden. I don't like the economy. So potentially I'm going to vote for somebody else. But that's really kind of a long shot. I think for the most part, it's going to be either Donald Trump or the Democrat. And there may be a few people that vote libertarian on the right, but it's not going to be consequential.
So a week or two ago, I had a wild thought that somehow neither DeSantis nor Trump would be
Yeah.
the nominee, which is still possible. But we're talking about dark horses, right?
Yep.
And so it is possible. However, now I figure my prediction is it's going to be exactly like last time. Exactly. It's going to be Biden and Trump, and it's going to be close, and Biden's going to win, and Trump and Trump's people are not going to accept it. And there's going to be an issue when it comes to uh, the certification. It's going to be exactly the same. My question is, have you heard of
Back to the
any
future.
legal measures? I don't know what's going on with my voice. Any legal? I kind of like it better. Any legal measures or organizational measures or political measures to prevent either party, probably Trump, from successfully denying the results of the election. Anything changed to prevent this from happening exactly the same next time?
No, not really. And I can totally see the scenario happening again. I don't see there's certainly, I can't see a scenario where, unless it's in a complete landslide, where Donald Trump comes out and says, you know what, I lost this election. It's hard for me to see that scenario. And there's always the potential that if he is losing, if he does lose the primary, that he himself gets the signatures and forms an independent or third party bid. Like Joe Lieberman did this in Connecticut, for example. He was going to lose the primary, so he went out and he got the ballot. He got the signatures in 2006. Ned Lamont wins the Democratic primary against Lieberman. Lieberman's then on the ballot as Connecticut for Lieberman, who has no primary. I guess if it was a primary, that'd be someone else with the name Lieberman, and they ends up winning. He ends up winning the Senate race. So that theoretically could happen, but I do think the wild card could be potentially if there is a no labels candidate, if there is a third party candidate that's formidable, then potentially right now most polls show that's probably going to help Donald Trump more than it's going to hurt him. So I think Donald Trump would probably want that to happen. But there's, of course, always the possibility that it could be somebody on the third party that's more right than left, and that could actually help Joe Biden. But that's really the wild card here.
All right. And as far as general perception of the Republican Party, the fact that Santos doesn't leave and his party's not kicking him out, I would think the party would want to kick him out. I know they need the vote. I get that. But as long as he's there, it tarnish them. I mean, some Republicans might go, "Good God, this is ridiculous. This is who we are. This guy is clearly like a super bad nut." And my party won't even get rid of him. I understand the vote thing. But how does it work if they got rid of him? Yeah. If they said, you got to leave, do they appoint someone, or is there a runoff election?
Well, first of all, it's a cost-benefit calculation about him staying in there. And actually, in 1924, there was about 9 Republicans. Again, the Republicans had an overwhelming majority. 9 Republicans voted for Robert LaFollette Sr., who was running as the Progressive Party candidate because they thought Calvin Coolidge was too liberal. So what happened when they got back to Washington? They were expelled from the Republican caucus. 9 were expelled from the Republican caucus by the Speaker of the House. Imagine that happening today. If 9 Republicans were expelled by Kevin McCarthy, the Democrats would have the majority. Now you're in a scenario where they can't expel one person, because if you expel that one person, it's actually going to matter. So what happens? Well, theoretically, it's very rare that somebody's actually expelled. The last one was James Traficant, who was alleged back in 2002, who was allegedly making his aides work on his farm and not paying them. So that was the last time this actually happened. And it's very rare for them. Before that, you had Mike Myers, who was part of the Abscan scam back in 1981. And he was not the baseball player or the actor, but the congressman from Pennsylvania. And he was essentially taking bribes. He was caught with he was caught in this. He was caught in surveillance, and he had to be expelled. Usually they land up resigning first, but what happens if they're actually expelled is essentially there's a vacancy. And usually what happens if there's a vacancy is there's a special election. And the special election, this is a Democratic-leaning district, and part of the reason George Santos won last time is because Lee Zeldin was the Republican gubernatorial nominee, and Lee Zeldin was bringing out members of the Republican base because he overperformed in he's a Republican who overperformed. He brought out members of the Republican base, and many of them on Long Island also supported George Santos. It's a marginal district. It could basically go either way, but it's a little bit more Democrat than it is Republican. At least
there's a chance they could lose that.
Oh, yeah, I think the chances, especially after what happened and the underbrush of George Santos, the chances are that the Democrats will take the seat. But that being said, even though the Republicans would still have a 4-seat majority, it might be that it's better to get that monkey off their back now. And and deal without having Kevin McCarthy every day asked about George Santos. Once again, he's asked one way. On the one hand, if you keep George Santos in the United States Congress, you have somebody that's going to vote for Republican measures, and you have basically a little bit of security. But on the other hand, every day you're asked about George Santos, and George Santos, as the Democrats would love to have George Santos the face card of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
If George Santos does run for re-election, he's probably going to lose the primary. The entire Republican Party has pretty much come out against him. He'll probably lose the primary miserably, but he said he's going to run for re-election.
Wow. I wonder if there are other people like George Santos
Who don't get caught?
in high office that we just don't know about.
Well, usually it's the smart ones that don't get caught. So I would assume, that there are that I don't think there's anybody that's gone to the extreme as George Santos. But certainly there are people in the United States Congress who have certainly had a hyperbolic in terms of their resume, in terms of their accomplishments. My guess is it's probably just like any other field. If you really kind of narrow it down, there's going to be some people who are crooks, some people who aren't. Most people are someone in the middle. But he's obviously an extreme example, and the Democrats will try to. I don't think it's going to work necessarily trying to tether every Republican to George Santos, because George Santos's issues are specific to him. They're not necessarily based on any ideology. They're just somebody who had ethical transgressions who could either be a Republican or a Democrat. Now, if it's somebody who says something like Marjorie Taylor Greene, like impeaching Joe Biden or something that's very unpopular nationally, that's who you allocate the person to.
How come the left doesn't make up cool names for the right, like Trump does for the left? Crooked Hillary. And how come there's no real good nickname? There's Marjorie Trader Greene. That's not too bad. But I think the Democrats, the left's got to get better at nicknames. I mean, that stuff works.
It's a good point. Usually when people have taken on Trump, the last one was Marco Rubio talking about him having large hands and everything else. It backfired on him. He was in Virginia. He gave a
Little
speech.
Marco?
Little Marco. People still remember Marco as Little Marco, but not the way that Marco tried to then take on Donald Trump. If someone were to give a nickname to Donald Trump, Tim Kaine in his convention speech in 2016 tried to take on Donald Trump a little bit, making fun of him. Never really worked. I've never seen anybody actually take on Donald Trump from the left and really be successful. Maybe give him the same nickname, Crooked Donald or, Lion Donald, like he used to give to Ted Cruz. But
nobody can come up with a decent name for him. It's funny.
That's his niche. Donald Trump's niche is.
In all the rest of the world, there's nobody smart to come up with cool nicknames.
I'm sure there are cool nicknames. I just think it's something that Donald Trump has really mastered.
Yeah.
So if you then give it back to him, people are going to. It's something that he's Teflon in that respect. And most of the nicknames he comes up with are not particularly creative. Calling someone Lion for Ted Cruz, I doubt he sat there I doubt he had a committee and they thought, what should we call Ted Cruz? And they said, well, what do you think we should call him? What do you think we should? Well, he's from Texas. Why don't we call him Texas Ted Cruz? No. Well, potentially, he's somebody from he went to Ivy League schools. Why don't we call him Harvard Ted Cruz? Then probably they came down, well, what about we call him Lion Ted Cruz? And then they, I don't know where this comes from, but I think it just comes from the memory of one Donald Trump.
Oh, yeah. Ted Cruz, has he got any aspirations to do anything?
Oh, yeah. He's not going to run for president. He said he will not if Donald Trump runs. He's actually running for re-election. Wayne Allard, a former professional football player, college player, congressman from Texas, is running. Ted Cruz is already basically trying to call him part of the far left. But he actually is probably one of the most vulnerable Republicans running for re-election. He's not really, his job approval rating is not above 50%. Texas is somewhat of a, it's basically becoming, it's from a red to a purple state. But he's somebody that potentially could have a very tough re-election on his hands in 2024.
Good. He's
going to try though to cruise to victory.
I get it.
Uh-huh.
Okay. We haven't talked about the left at all. Any dark horses? Could they emerge from the left? Says that is our topic. I guess anybody would be a dark horse. Pretty much.
But nobody other than Robert Kennedy Jr. and Marianne Williamson, nobody is going to challenge Joe Biden. It's like the third rail of American politics. If anybody challenges Joe Biden, they're going to be blackballed in the party for any future race.
Yeah.
It's the Democrats, not because they like Joe Biden, because they loathe Donald Trump. They want the party to be unified. And he's
got a winning record. He did beat Donald Trump. I mean, that's good.
Yes. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And they say we need this person to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. If some governor, some senator, some congressman comes in there and runs against them, unless there's somebody at the end of their end of their political life who's using this as a bucket list, who really there could be no repercussions on. You're going to lose if you run against Joe Biden miserably, and you're going to probably, and if Joe Biden ends up losing the general election to Donald Trump, people are going to blame you for dividing the party in the primary. So it's really a no-win situation, other than if you're just trying to get publicity for a future run or a message or something like that. Robert Kennedy Jr. has nothing to lose, and a lot of his support is probably going to come from the right more so than the left. Marianne Williamson, she'll get a lot of support from people probably from outside of the political process, but I
Why
don't
is
really
Kennedy
see them
doing
actually
it?
being formidable.
Why is Kennedy doing it? For name recognition or for fun or ego?
I don't know. I mean, I think obviously when your last name's Kennedy, you have ecumenical name recognition. But my guess is it's because he has a message and he's trying to get that message out. If he runs in the Republican primary, he'll just be one of 38 other people. But if he runs in the Democratic primary, he's going to garner a lot more attention simply because the line is shorter.
What is his message?
His message, well, it's actually two-part. The main part is that he was somebody who's very questionable about the vaccines and thinks the pharmaceutical industry is essentially making money off of it. He was questioning the mask mandate. He said that he was questioning about the whole lockdowns. He's actually criticized Donald Trump. He said it created income inequality. He basically says it was a war on the poor, but also on issues like the environment. He's criticized both the Republican and the Democratic administration for not taking climate change seriously enough, for example. So he's basically the left on almost everything. But when it comes to vaccines, it's kind of a very populist type of a view that says that this is benefiting the pharmaceutical companies and that there's inequality. Yeah.
But that's kind of a niche thing. And I've already kind of forgotten about COVID. In 6 months, it's just not going to resonate much.
No, I don't think it will. I think he's going to have a base of support that's going to be cross-partisan, transpartisan, probably some people who are just not part of the political process.
So he's an anti-vaxxer candidate. That's it.
He's anti-vax mandate is what he would say. But he has other issues as well. He also talks about just generally, he has a very consistent message, actually. His general message is he's anti-corporation, he's anti-corporate power, and he's anti-income inequality. And he talks about the corporations having too much control, which is a typical Democratic issue. But he takes from the right. This is kind of the triangulation. You take from the left and the right. On the right-hand side, he's essentially saying that the vaccines and that specifically the mandates and all the lockdowns, he said, really hurt small businesses and essentially hurt the little people. So he's trying to take a conservative message and kind of amalgamate it with a traditional liberal message. He's trying to triangulate in many respects. So it's a very interesting message, and he can really appeal to a large cross-section of constituencies on that issue. But I don't see him certainly being formidable, and I cannot visit no scenario where Joe Biden debates either of them.
Elizabeth Warren, of course, is not going to run. She's way better off staying in the Senate, where she is probably quite powerful, and hopefully she's focusing on banking and that sort of thing. That's her bag, and I think it is important. I don't want to have another 2008 happen, and if she, can fight against new legislation that would make that more likely, that would be good. I guess we're done. I'm done. This was great. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. I greatly enjoyed it.
All right. So once again, I do have new videos of Spain and Portugal coming up. It's Bradley J. Travel on YouTube. And you have the book, the wonderful trivia book. Let's see it one more time. Come on now.
Yes.
You're always surprised. Yep, there it is. The Great American Political Trivia Challenge. Political trivia on steroids. Thank you for holding it up so I could read it, because I'll never remember that. Thank you very much. All right.
You are welcome.
Well, I will talk to you soon, and thanks to all the usual suspects. I get a little smarter about politics every time I talk to you. We didn't hear about, what is it, Bill Guy Tucker today.
Oh, Jim Guy Tucker.
Jim Guy Tucker,
yes. Yeah. The governor of Arkansas, who Bill Clinton defeated in 1982 to try to win his bid to try to recapture the governorship, who eventually became lieutenant governor of Arkansas and succeeded Bill Clinton as governor. So next time around, the ratings will soar if we do a show just on Jim Guy Tucker.
We talk about Jim. I just like the guy's name. I know you love to say the name too.
Jim Guy Tucker. I always try to figure an excuse to use it. Yes.
Jim Guy Tucker. All right. That is all, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon, Rich. And again, the new videos, I've been working on them. The first one is of a very fancy, a very nice hotel. It was only $95
Wow.
in Tangier. So that just posted the new video, everybody. I'll talk to you soon. Bye, Rich.
Thank you so much.